What becomes of a man when the country he built with his bones forgets his name? It is a question that hangs in the humid air of coastal towns where naval bases rust, and in the dry, cracked earth of desert outposts where the ghosts of old wars linger. The cold, hard truth of America is often found not in the marbled halls of its monuments, but under the harsh fluorescent lights of a corner grocery store, in the trembling hands of an old man counting out change for a can of beans. It is a truth written in the lines of a face that has seen too much and been thanked too little. For Sergeant Major Thomas Sterling, United States Marine Corps, retired, that truth was the chill that seeped through the single-pane window of his small, rented room. It was the dull ache in his replaced hip, a piece of government-issue titanium that was now more a part of him than the memories it had replaced. It was the silence, a profound, crushing silence that had none of the respectful quiet of a memorial, but all of the empty loneliness of a forgotten grave. His world had shrunk to the four peeling walls of this room. A single bed with a threadbare wool blanket, olive drab, a relic from a time when he commanded not just a room, but the respect of hundreds of men. A hot plate sat on a rickety wooden crate, its single coil glowing a sullen red in the dim light. Next to it, a can of generic brand chili con carne, his dinner for the night. A small, black and white television with a coat hanger for an antenna flickered in the corner, a ghost of a life happening somewhere else, to someone else. On the wall, above the bed, was the only testament to the man he had been. A shadow box, its glass cloudy with dust. Inside, the deep purple of a heart, the burnished bronze of a star with a V for valor, and a constellation of campaign ribbons that told a story of frozen hills in Korea and steaming jungles in Vietnam. At the very center, displayed with a reverence that defied the squalor of its surroundings, was the eagle, globe, and anchor. The emblem was not merely a piece of metal. It was the core of his being, the symbol of a covenant he had made with his nation, a promise to give everything. A promise he had kept. He ran a hand over his face, the skin as thin and dry as parchment. He could feel the bones beneath, the architecture of a life lived hard. He was 86 years old, a fact that surprised him every morning he woke up. So many others, younger, stronger, better men, had not been granted this dubious luxury of time. They remained forever young on the frozen slopes of the chosen reservoir or in the humid, suffocating green of the A Shao Valley. He had carried their faces with him for decades, a private honor guard for the fallen. But lately, the faces were fading. The memories, once sharp as shrapnel, were becoming dull and indistinct, like stones worn smooth by a relentless tide. What was replacing them was a gnawing, persistent anxiety. It came in the form of letters, official-looking envelopes with bold, threatening print. Final notice. Demand for payment. They were from a man named Thorne, Marcus Thorne. A man with a smile as slick and artificial as the vinyl seats in his luxury car. Thorne called himself a financial advisor. He had appeared a few months ago, a referral from a veterans outreach program that had since vanished. He spoke of unlocking equity and consolidating assets to Sterling, who had balanced battalion logistics on a clipboard in a driving monsoon. The words were a foreign language. He only knew that his small pension, the one he had earned with 40 years of his life, was no longer enough. The rent on his room had tripled. The cost of food, of medicine, of simply existing, was a war of attrition he was losing. Thorne had presented a solution. Papers. Lots of them. He had explained them with a practiced, soothing cadence, his words sliding over the complex legal terms like water over oil. It's just a simple reverse mortgage, Tom, he had said, his use of the first name an easy, unearned familiarity that had set Sterling's teeth on edge. It allows you to access the value of your family home without having to sell. The bank pays you. You get to stay right where you are. Except he wasn't in his family home. That house, the one his wife, Eleanor, had filled with the scent of baked bread and the sound of laughter, had been sold years ago to pay for her medical bills. The cancer had taken her, and the cost of fighting it had taken everything else. The money Thorne was talking about was from what little remained of that sale, an inheritance he had guarded fiercely, the last tangible piece of his life with her. He had signed the papers. His hand, gnarled with arthritis, had trembled as he held the pen. He felt a deep, instinctual wrongness in the act, the same gut-level alarm that had screamed at him moments before an ambush. But the numbers on the eviction notices were real. The gnawing hunger was real. The shame of his poverty was a heavier burden than any rucksack he had ever carried. So he signed. Now, the small monthly payments Thorne had promised had stopped. The letters from Thorne's company, Apex Holdings, had started. They spoke of default, of contractual breaches, of immediate seizure of assets. The language was cold, brutal, and final. He had tried to call Thorne. The number was disconnected. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He had faced down enemy machine gun nests. He had held the line against human wave attacks in sub-zero temperatures. He had charged into a wall of fire to pull his wounded men to safety. Yet he was being defeated by a piece of paper, by a man with a shark-like smile and empty eyes. The indignity of it was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. His gaze drifted back to the shadow box. He pushed himself up from the bed, his joints protesting with a series of sharp cracks and groans. He stood before the metals, his reflection a pale, wavering ghost on the glass. He saw not the decorated sergeant major, but a frail, tired old man. A relic. The word echoed in his mind. Thorne's word, whispered with condescending pity. He needed to remember. He needed to feel the steel in his spine one more time. Tomorrow, the 1st Marine Division was conducting a full-dress parade at Camp Pendleton, just a few miles down the coast. He had read about it in the local paper. A change of command ceremony. He imagined the crisp snap of the flags in the ocean breeze, the precise, unified stomp of 1,000 boots on the asphalt, the thunderous call of the drill instructor's voice, the sound of order, of discipline, of honor. He wanted to see it. He needed to see it. Just to stand outside the gate, to hear the sounds, to breathe the same air as the young Marines who now carried the legacy. It would be enough. It would be a reminder that the world he had given his life to still existed, even if it had no place for him anymore. He made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go. He would take the bus. He would stand at the fence like a child peering into a candy store. It was a small, desperate pilgrimage, a journey back to the only church he had ever known. He would go, and for a few hours, he would try to forget the name Marcus Thorne and the crushing weight of the papers on his nightstand. He would try to remember the man in the box. The cabin was silent, but the war was loud. It lived in the space between heartbeats, in the whisper of the wind through the tall pines that surrounded the isolated clearing. For Jack Kellen, former Force Recon Marine, the silence of the mountains was a lie. He had come here seeking it, chasing it like a phantom, but the noise had followed him. It was packed deep inside his skull, a permanent part of his internal landscape. He sat on the rough-hewn porch, a massive shape of muscle and scars poured into a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans. His arms, corded and thick, were a tapestry of ink that told stories of brotherhood and loss. A stylized Viking skull on his bicep, a memorial to a fallen teammate. The Recon Jack on his forearm. He was built like a brick wall, solid and immovable, but inside, the foundations were cracked. His hands, capable of dismantling a rifle in seconds or delivering a killing blow with surgical precision, were wrapped around a mug of black coffee. The steam rose into the cold morning air, mingling with his breath. His eyes, the color of chipped flint, were fixed on the distant peaks, but they weren't seeing the majestic sweep of granite and snow. They were seeing the dusty, sun-blasted mountains of Afghanistan. The muzzle flashes. The face of his best friend, Sergeant Dave Echo Riley, in the moment before the IED, turned their world into a storm of fire and metal. Grief was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to him even in the brightest sunlight. It was the reason he was here, in this self-imposed exile. After Echo's death, the Corps had felt different. The missions, once a source of righteous purpose, became a blur of violence. The lines between protector and destroyer began to fray. He had served his time, finished his contract, and walked away. He had walked away from the only life he had known since he was 18, hoping to leave the ghosts behind. But ghosts didn't respect discharge papers. A heavy head pressed against his thigh. A low, guttural whine, more a vibration than a sound, rumbled in the stillness. Kellen looked down. Staring up at him were the intelligent, amber eyes of havoc. The German shepherd was as much a veteran as he was. A former multi-purpose canine, Havoc had 2 tours in the Helmand province under his collar. His sleek black and tan coat was marred by a thick, puckered scar along his flank, a reminder of the shrapnel that had retired him from service. Kellen had adopted him from the same program that tried to rehome military working dogs. He had gone looking for a dog and found a mirror. Havoc was massive, nearly 120 pounds of coiled muscle and disciplined instinct. He moved with a predatory grace that was unsettling in its efficiency. But like Kellen, he was haunted. He would sometimes startle from a deep sleep with a sharp bark, his eyes scanning the trees for threats that weren't there. He carried his own war inside him. "Easy, boy," Kellen murmured, his voice a low gravel. He ran his hand over the dog's broad head, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of his skull. Havoc leaned into the touch, the tension in his powerful body easing slightly. The dog was his anchor, his early warning system, his confessor. In the depths of the night, when the nightmares came and Kellen woke up drenched in sweat, the solid, breathing presence of the dog beside him was the only thing that kept him from splintering apart. They were 2 broken soldiers, finding a fragile peace in each other's company. Their routine was simple, monastic. Up before dawn, a long, punishing run through the mountain trails. Training drills in the clearing, obedience, scent work, controlled aggression. It kept them sharp. More importantly, it kept them tired. Exhaustion was the closest Kellen could get to peace. He had built this life as a fortress against the world. No television, no internet, just a satellite phone for emergencies. He went into the small town at the base of the mountain once a week for supplies, his interactions clipped and minimal. He didn't want connection. Connection meant vulnerability. Connection meant something to lose. He had lost enough. But the fortress was starting to feel like a prison. The silence he had craved was amplifying the noise in his head. The memories had nowhere to go, so they played on a loop, each one more vivid than the last. He saw Echo's grin, heard his laugh. He felt the crushing weight of the responsibility he carried for his death. He had been the team leader. It had been his call to take that route. His call. He finished his coffee, the dregs cold and bitter. He stood up, the porch groaning under his weight. "Let's go, Havoc," he said. "Time to move." The dog was instantly on his feet, tail giving a single, solid thump against Kellen's leg. His focus was absolute, his gaze locked on his handler. Ready. Always ready. Kellen had a purpose for today's trip into town. It was the anniversary of Echo's death. Every year, he drove down to the coast, to Camp Pendleton. He didn't go on base. He just parked his truck on a bluff overlooking the ocean, near the main gate. He would sit there for an hour, share a beer with his friend's memory, and watch the young Marines, the new generation, running in formation along the beach. It was a private, painful ritual, a way of staying connected to the world he had left without having to actually touch it. He grabbed his keys and a worn leather leash. As he clipped it to Havoc's collar, the dog looked up at him, a deep intelligence in his eyes. He knew. He could sense the shift in Kellen's mood, the somber weight that settled on him on this particular day. He didn't whine or pull. He just stood, a silent, steady presence. A warrior's vigil. They got into the old, black Ford F-250, a beast of a truck that was as functional and unadorned as Kellen himself. Havoc hopped into the passenger seat, not like a pet, but like a partner, his head held high as he scanned the perimeter. Kellen started the engine, the powerful diesel roaring to life, shattering the mountain quiet. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the cabin, leaving his sanctuary of silence behind. He was driving toward a memory. He didn't know that he was also driving toward a new mission. The kind of mission he thought he had left behind forever. The kind that finds a man, whether he is looking for it or not. The main gate of Camp Pendleton was a formidable affair of concrete barriers, steel fences, and guard posts manned by Marines who looked barely old enough to shave. Their youth was a stark contrast to the lethal efficiency in their eyes and the crisp, disciplined way they handled their M4 rifles. They were the gatekeepers of a world apart, a universe governed by its own laws of physics and honor. Kellen parked his truck on the shoulder of the road, about 100 yards away, on a dusty overlook that offered a clear view of the gate and the long, palm-lined road that led to the heart of the base. The Pacific Ocean glittered to his right, an endless sheet of hammered blue steel. He cut the engine, and the silence was immediately filled by the rhythmic crash of waves and the distant, rhythmic chant of a platoon on a run. Havoc sat patiently in the passenger seat, his window rolled down, his nose twitching as he sorted through the complex scents on the sea breeze: salt, diesel, asphalt, and the faint, unmistakable smell of disciplined sweat. Kellen reached into a small cooler in the back and pulled out 2 beers. He opened one and set it on the empty dashboard. "For you, brother," he murmured. He opened the other for himself. He was watching the gate, his mind a million miles away in a dusty Afghan village, when a small commotion caught his eye. A city bus had wheezed to a stop across the highway, and a single passenger had disembarked. It was an old man, moving with a slow, deliberate stiffness that spoke of chronic pain. He was thin, almost frail, dressed in worn but clean slacks and a faded windbreaker. He clutched a local newspaper in one hand. The old man carefully crossed the busy road, his head on a swivel, a lifetime of situational awareness still intact despite his physical decline. He approached the pedestrian entrance to the gate, where 2 young lance corporals stood guard, their expressions a mixture of institutional seriousness and youthful boredom. Kellen watched, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his grief-soaked apathy. Then another car, a gleaming black Mercedes sedan that looked ridiculously out of place, pulled up and parked haphazardly behind the bus stop. A man in an expensive-looking, ill-fitting suit got out. He was in his 50s, with a soft, fleshy face, a comb-over that did little to hide his balding scalp, and a perpetual smirk. He strode impatiently toward the gate, intercepting the old man. "Tom, for God's sake, what are you doing?" the man in the suit said, his voice carrying on the wind, sharp and condescending. "I told you I'd handle this. You don't just wander off." The old man, Sterling, straightened his back. The movement was subtle, but to Kellen, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the instinctive reaction of a senior NCO being addressed with disrespect. "I wanted to watch the parade, Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice thin but laced with an undeniable thread of dignity. "The 1st Division." Thorne let out an exasperated sigh, a theatrical display of impatience. "The parade? Tom, they're not putting on a show for you. These are busy, important people. They don't have time for nostalgia." He gestured vaguely at the base. "Now, I have the final papers in the car. We need to get them signed today. The bank is getting antsy." Sterling's gaze was fixed on the gate, on the flag snapping crisply in the wind. "I just want to watch for a little while," he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "From the fence. I won't be any bother." At Kellen's side, Havoc shifted. A low, barely audible whine escaped his throat. His body tensed, his head lowered slightly, his eyes locked on the scene. It was a subtle shift, but Kellen knew what it meant. The dog sensed distress. Not a physical threat, but an emotional one. A violation. The 2 lance corporals at the gate had taken notice. One of them, a kid with a spray of freckles across his nose, stepped forward. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Thorne flashed a slick, dismissive smile. "Just collecting my client," he said, putting a hand on Sterling's shoulder. The old man flinched. "He's a little confused today. Big fan of the military, you know? A relic." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Relic. Kellen felt his knuckles whiten around his beer bottle. The young Marine, however, just nodded, his expression unchanging. He saw an old, confused man and a man in a suit who seemed to be in charge. It was a civilian matter. "Sir, this is a restricted area. Unless you have official business, you can't remain here." "Of course, officer," Thorne said, misidentifying the Marine's rank with casual ignorance. He started to guide Sterling back toward the car. "Come on, Tom. Let's go sign those papers and get you your money." But Sterling stood his ground. He pulled away from Thorne's grip, his chin lifting. "I am Sergeant Major Thomas Sterling," he said, his voice regaining a measure of its old command. "I served 30 years in the United States Marine Corps. I am not a relic, and I would like permission to watch the parade." The declaration, which should have carried immense weight, was met with a blank stare from the young guard and an eye roll from Thorne. "See," Thorne said with a sigh. "He gets like this. Look, we're leaving." It was at that exact moment that a black staff car with a single star on its license plate made a smooth, quiet turn toward the gate. The guards snapped to attention, their postures transforming from bored sentries to rigid symbols of military discipline. The car slowed to a stop, and the rear window glided down. Inside sat a man in his late 50s, his uniform immaculate, a constellation of ribbons on his chest. A single silver star shone on each collar. Brigadier General Wallace, commander of the base. His face was weathered, etched with the deep lines of command and responsibility. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. His ramrod-straight sentries, the smirking civilian, and the frail old man who stood with a desperate, defiant pride. "What's the situation here, Lance Corporal?" The general's voice was calm, but it held an unmistakable edge of authority that cut through the air. "Sir," the young Marine stammered, his face flushing. "Civilian matters, sir. This gentleman was loitering. This other gentleman is his guardian, I think. We were just asking them to move along." The general's gaze settled on Sterling. He looked at the old man's face, the set of his jaw, the unwavering look in his faded blue eyes. He looked for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a flicker of recognition, a subtle widening of his eyes. In one smooth, decisive motion, General Wallace opened his door and stepped out of the car. He was a tall, imposing man, but he moved with a quiet reverence as he approached Sterling. He ignored Thorne completely, his focus entirely on the old man. He stopped a single pace in front of him. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the general's back went rigid. His right hand snapped up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. It was not the casual salute for a junior officer. It was the deeply respectful salute reserved for a Medal of Honor recipient or a legend of the Corps. "Sergeant Major Sterling." The general's voice rang out, clear and strong, filled with a profound and genuine awe. "It is an honor, sir." The word "sir" hit the air like a thunderclap. Thorne's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. The two young lance corporals stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. A general, calling a sergeant major sir? It was a reversal of the natural order of the universe. Sterling, for his part, seemed to grow 3 inches. The frailty fell away, replaced by the ingrained discipline of a lifetime. He brought his own hand up, his movements slow but sure, and returned the salute. "General Wallace," he said, his voice steady. The general dropped his salute and extended his hand. "I read your Medal of Honor citation when I was a lieutenant at the basic school, Sergeant Major. Hill 1282. Chosen Reservoir. You held the flank for 2 days, alone, after your entire platoon was overrun. Sir, you are a living legend." He turned his head slightly, his eyes, now cold as ice, fixing on the 2 young sentries. "You are standing in the presence of Corps royalty, and you were telling him to move along?" The blood drained from the young Marines' faces. "Sir, we didn't know," one of them whispered, his voice trembling. "Your job is to know." Wallace's voice wasn't a shout, but it had the cutting power of one. "Look at him. The bearing. The pride. You see an old man. I see a hero of the Corps. Your hero. Relearn your history." Now he turned back to Sterling, his expression softening instantly. "Sergeant Major, you wanted to watch the parade? You will be my guest of honor. You will sit with me on the reviewing stand." He then turned his gaze, for the first time, to Marcus Thorne. It was a look of pure, undiluted contempt. "And who?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "Are you?" Thorne, flustered and suddenly sweating, tried to recover his slick composure. "Marcus Thorne. I'm Mr. Sterling's financial advisor. I was just trying to. You were just trying to rush a hero of this nation." The general cut him off. "I saw your car. I saw your attitude. I don't know what your game is, Mr. Thorne, but it ends now. Get off my base's doorstep." He gestured to one of the guards. "Get this man's license plate number. And his name. I want to know who he is." Thorne's face cycled through anger, embarrassment, and finally, fear. He shot a venomous glare at Sterling, a look of pure hatred, before scurrying back to his Mercedes and speeding away with a squeal of tires. From his truck, Kellen watched the entire exchange, his beer forgotten in his hand. A cold, familiar rage was building in his chest. He had seen predators like Thorne before, circling the vulnerable, smelling weakness. He recognized the look in Thorne's eyes as he drove away. It was the look of a jackal that had its meal snatched away. A jackal that would be back. The general gently guided Sergeant Major Sterling toward his staff car. "We'll get you a front-row seat, Sergeant Major. The commandant himself would give up his chair for you." As the car disappeared through the gate, Kellen finally took a drink of his beer. It was warm. The ritual was broken. The quiet day of remembrance was over. He had witnessed an injustice, temporarily halted by a chance encounter with an honorable man. But Kellen knew that men like Thorne didn't give up. They just found another, darker alley to do their work in. Kellen started his truck. He wasn't going to sit on the bluff and reminisce anymore. He had a new objective. He would wait. He would wait for the sergeant major to leave the base, and then he would make sure he got home safe. The hunt had begun. He didn't know the details yet, but his instincts, honed by years of combat, were screaming. The old Marine was the target, and Kellen had just appointed himself his guardian. The war had come home, not with the roar of explosions, but with the quiet, insidious rustle of legal papers and the smirk of a corporate predator. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, when the base gates opened to release the civilian traffic from the parade. Kellen had waited for over 3 hours. Patience was a skill he had mastered in the patient profession of stalking men. He had spent the time cleaning his sidearm, a SIG Sauer P226 that rarely left his side, and watching the ebb and flow of life around the military installation. Havoc dozed in the passenger seat, though his ears twitched at every passing vehicle, a living radar system at rest. He saw him immediately. Sergeant Major Sterling was not in a staff car this time. He was walking, his posture still straighter than it had been that morning, a spark of the day's honors still clinging to him. The general had likely offered him a ride anywhere he wanted to go, but Kellen suspected the old Marine's pride had compelled him to refuse. He was probably headed back to the bus stop. A man who had commanded battalions would not want to be an imposition. Kellen put the truck in gear and coasted slowly across the highway, pulling up alongside the old man. He rolled down the passenger window. Havoc lifted his head, his intelligent eyes fixing on Sterling. "Sergeant Major." Kellen's voice was a low rumble. Sterling stopped and looked at the truck, then at the man inside. He saw the hard lines of Kellen's face, the military bearing that no civilian clothes could hide, and the massive shepherd sitting in the passenger seat. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cautious curiosity. "I'm a Marine," Kellen said, by way of introduction. It was all that was needed. "I saw what happened at the gate this morning. Figured you could use a ride home instead of the bus." Sterling studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and appraising. He was evaluating Kellen, not as a potential threat, but as a man. He saw the recon jack tattooed on his forearm. His expression softened. "Force recon." "Yes, Sergeant Major." A small, sad smile touched Sterling's lips. "They didn't have that designation when I was coming up. We were just the poor bastards they sent in first," he nodded. "I'd appreciate the ride. My hips aren't what they used to be." "Havoc, back," Kellen commanded quietly. The German shepherd instantly hopped over the center console into the extended cab's back seat, settling onto a blanket with practiced ease. Kellen got out and opened the passenger door for the old Marine. Sterling moved slowly, carefully lowering himself into the seat. "Thank you, son." He looked at the dog in the back. "He's a fine-looking animal." "He's a veteran, too," Kellen said, getting back behind the wheel. "MPC, multi-purpose canine." "I'll be damned," Sterling said, a genuine warmth in his voice. A devil dog's devil dog. He reached a trembling hand back, and Havoc, uncharacteristically gentle, leaned forward and licked his fingers. A bond of shared service, unspoken and profound, formed in the cab of the truck. "Where to, Sergeant Major?" Sterling gave him the address, a street in a rundown part of Oceanside that Kellen knew was miles from the sparkling beachfront condos and tourist traps. As they drove, a comfortable silence settled between them, the silence of men who understood that not everything needed to be said. "It was a good parade," Sterling said finally, his voice soft. "The new generation. They look sharp. Strong. Makes a man proud." "Yes, it does," Kellen agreed. "General Wallace is a good man," Sterling continued, almost to himself. "His father, Colonel Wallace, was my CO in Nam. I didn't realize who he was until he said the name." Kellen just nodded, letting the man talk. He was reconnoitering, gathering intelligence not with satellites and drones, but with empathy and silence. The neighborhood devolved as they drove. Manicured lawns gave way to brown, patchy grass and chain-link fences. Brightly painted storefronts were replaced by boarded-up windows and faded graffiti. Finally, Sterling pointed to a dilapidated two-story apartment building with peeling paint and rust-stained balconies. "This is it. Number 7-inch. Kellen pulled the truck to the curb. He looked at the building, then back at the man who had held a hill against an entire enemy division. The disconnect was a physical blow. This was not a place for a hero. This was a place of last resort. "Let me walk you up, Sergeant Major." It wasn't a question. He and Havoc escorted Sterling to the door of his small, ground-floor apartment. When Sterling unlocked it and pushed it open, a wave of stale, cold air washed over them. The bleakness of the single room was starker in person than Kellen could have imagined. The hot plate, the can of chili, the threadbare blanket. It was a cell of poverty and loneliness. Kellen's eyes swept the room, his tactical senses cataloging everything. He saw the shadow box on the wall, a shrine of honor in a temple of decay. And he saw the stack of letters on the small, wobbly nightstand. White envelopes with a sharp, aggressive blue logo. Apex Holdings. "That man this morning. Thorne," Kellen began, his voice carefully neutral. "You said he was your financial advisor." Sterling sighed, a weary, defeated sound. He sank onto the edge of his bed, the springs groaning in protest. "He was supposed to be. Said he could help me. My pension. It doesn't go as far as it used to." "What did you sign, Sergeant Major?" Kellen's voice was gentle, but there was an underlying firmness, the tone of a team leader trying to get a critical piece of intel from a rattled squad mate. Sterling gestured vaguely at the letters. "Papers. A lot of them. Something about the money from my wife's house. A loan. He said it would give me enough to live on." He looked up at Kellen, his eyes filled with a deep, profound shame. "I think I made a mistake, son. A bad one. The payments stopped coming. Now these letters. They say I'm in default. They say they're taking everything." Kellen walked over to the nightstand and picked up the top envelope. The language inside was predatory, filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate and confuse. It spoke of accelerated clauses, foreclosure, and immediate seizure of all listed assets. It was a declaration of financial warfare against a man who had no means to fight back. He found what he was looking for at the bottom of the page, a reference number and a list of assets, which included a bank account number. It was the clue, the starting point. A cold, clean fury settled over Kellen. It was different from the hot, explosive rage of combat. This was a calculating anger, a righteous fire that burned away all the fog of his own grief and focused his world into a single, sharp point of purpose. This was not an IED on a dusty road. This was a sniper, hiding in plain sight, picking off the weak and the honorable one by one. And Kellen knew how to deal with snipers. "Sergeant Major," Kellen said, his voice now devoid of all softness, replaced by the hard certainty of command. "You didn't make a mistake. You were targeted. This is a battlefield, and you were ambushed." He looked at the old Marine, whose face was a mask of confusion and despair. "But you're not alone on this hill anymore. Reinforcements have arrived." He pulled out his satellite phone. He had one number saved in it under the name Oracle. He stepped outside the apartment door, Havoc at his heel, standing guard. He pressed the call button. It was answered on the second ring. "You know, for a guy who wants to be a hermit, you call me a lot," a cheerful, tech-laced voice said from the other end. "Oz, I have a mission for you," Kellen said, his voice flat and cold. There were no pleasantries. There was no time. "I'm sending you a company name and a bank account number. The company is Apex Holdings. The man is Marcus Thorne. I want to know everything. I want to know who he is, what he does, and who he's done it to. I want a target package. And I want it yesterday." There was a pause on the other end, the cheerful tone gone, replaced by the seriousness of a fellow professional. Oz, formerly Sergeant Miguel Ortiz, had been the comms and tech specialist on Kellen's team. He had lost both his legs to the same IED that had killed Echo. Now he operated from a basement in San Diego, a digital ghost who could walk through any firewall in the world. "Who's the target?" Oz asked. "A predator," Kellen replied. "And who's the victim?" Kellen looked through the open door at Sergeant Major Sterling, sitting on his bed, a monument of American heroism being eroded by time and villainy. A goddamn hero, Kellen said, his voice thick with a fury he hadn't felt in years. One of our own. Say no more, Oz said. The oracle is in. Go dark. I'll call you when I have the scripture. Kellen ended the call. He went back inside. Sergeant Major, you're not staying here tonight, he said. Pack a bag. Just the essentials. Your medication. Your papers, he pointed to the shadow box. And that. You're coming with me. Sterling looked up, confused. Coming with you where? To a safe house, Kellen answered. My cabin. Thorne knows where you are. He's a coward, and cowards get desperate. You're a high-value asset, and I'm moving you to a secure location until the threat is neutralized. The old Marine's training, buried under decades of civilian life, flickered in his eyes. He understood the language. He understood the gravity in Kellen's tone. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't a victim. He was part of an operation. He nodded slowly, then pushed himself to his feet. Affirmative, he said, the single word crisp and clear. The sergeant major was back on duty. The drive back up the mountain was tense. Kellen's eyes were constantly scanning the rearview mirror, his senses on high alert. He was back in the zone, the hyper-aware state of a man moving through hostile territory. Sergeant Major Sterling sat in the passenger seat, his few belongings in a small duffel bag at his feet. He held the shadow box on his lap, cradling it like a priceless artifact. Havoc sat in the back, a silent, watchful sentinel. They didn't talk much. The mission had been established. The roles were clear. Kellen was the operator. Sterling was the asset. The unspoken trust between them was absolute, forged in the common crucible of the Corps. When they reached the cabin, the sun had long since vanished, and the moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the pines. Kellen led Sterling inside. The cabin was Spartan, but it was clean and solid, a world away from the crumbling decay of the apartment. You can take the bed, Kellen said, gesturing to the single bedroom. I'll take the couch. I can't do that, son, Sterling protested. This is your home. You're not a guest, Sergeant Major. You're under protective custody, Kellen stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It's for tactical reasons. The bedroom is the most defensible position. Sterling looked at him, a glint of understanding in his eye. He recognized the benevolent lie, the gesture of respect cloaked in the language of strategy. He simply nodded. Thank you. Kellen prepared a simple meal, grilled chicken and rice, a far cry from the canned chili Sterling had been facing. They ate at the small wooden table. Sterling ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite. It was likely the first decent meal he'd had in months. After dinner, Sterling, exhausted by the day's emotional roller coaster, retired to the bedroom. Kellen cleaned the dishes with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. He then sat on the porch, his satellite phone on the table in front of him, and waited. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night, but Kellen's hearing was tuned for a single, specific frequency, the incoming call from Oz. It came just after midnight. The phone buzzed, a jarring, electronic sound in the organic symphony of the wilderness. Kellen answered before the first buzz had faded. Talk to me. You're not going to like this, Jack. Oz's voice was grim. The cheerful hacker was gone, replaced by the somber intel analyst. This Thorne guy, he's not a jackal. He's a plague. Give it to me. Apex Holdings is a shell corporation, one of about 20. Oz began, the sound of furious typing in the background. They're all registered to post office boxes. But I peeled the onion. The money trail. It all leads back to one man, Marcus Thorne. He's not just a financial advisor. He's a bottom feeder of the lowest order. His business model is evil. Kellen remained silent, letting him work. He's got a system, Oz continued. He gets lists of elderly veterans, specifically those with service-related disabilities, low income, and some form of home equity or savings. He uses defunct or fake veterans outreach programs to make the initial contact, builds a rapport. Then he hits them with the high-pressure sales pitch. Reverse mortgages with insane, predatory terms. Annuity scams. He gets them to sign over power of attorney. Once he has control, he bleeds them dry, drains their accounts, forces a default on the bogus loans he set up, and then his holding company seizes the property for pennies on the dollar. The cold fury in Kellen's chest was turning into a white-hot star. How many? I'm still digging, but so far, I've found 42 victims across 3 states. All of them Marines, Army, Navy veterans. All of them from the Korea and Vietnam eras. Men in their 70s and 80s. He's stolen their homes, their life savings, their dignity. I've found foreclosure notices, bankruptcy filings. Jack, I've found 5 death certificates. Kellen's blood ran cold. Explain. The stress, man, Oz said, his voice thick with disgust. 2 died from heart attacks within a month of receiving their final eviction notices. 3 others. Suicides. They were found with the foreclosure papers from Thorne's company next to them. The authorities wrote it off. Old men, depressed, poor health. No one connected the dots. Kellen closed his eyes. The faces of the men he had lost in combat flashed in his mind. Now, they were joined by the spectral faces of old soldiers who had survived the worst battles of the 20th century, only to be driven to their deaths by a man in a suit. This wasn't just theft. This was murder. This is a new level of scumbag, Jack, Oz said. He's not just stealing money. He's erasing heroes. He's preying on the one thing they have left, their pride. He makes them feel like failures, like burdens. And they just give up. The horrifying revelation settled in Kellen's soul, a weight of dark, terrible clarity. The mission had just been elevated. This wasn't about recovering one man's money anymore. This was about avenging the fallen and liberating the captives. The stakes were no longer financial. They were existential. Where is he? Kellen's voice was dangerously quiet. He has a penthouse office in a high-rise in Irvine. Thorne Financial Group. Very public, very legitimate looking. He hides in plain sight, Oz reported. He lives in a gated community in Newport Beach. Security is tight in both places. But he has a routine. He works late on Tuesdays. Alone. His staff leaves at 5. He stays until 9 or 10, cooking the books. Kellen looked at his watch. It was Monday, just past midnight. So, effectively, Tuesday morning. Tonight, Kellen said. I figured you'd say that, Oz replied. The office building is the Irvine Corporate Plaza. I'm already inside their security system. It's a joke. Commercial-grade crap. I can loop the cameras in the service corridors and elevators. But the office itself has its own internal system. High-end. Biometric lock on his personal office. I can't get you through that door electronically. Don't have to, Kellen said. Just get me into the building. Give me a blind spot. Consider it done. I'll text you the schematics. Service elevator on the north side of the parking garage. It'll be waiting for you on the ground floor. I'll take it offline for 5 minutes. That'll get you to the top floor, the 30th. Thorne's office is at the end of the west corridor. Suite 3000. After that, you're on your own. You'll be a ghost in the machine until you walk into that hallway. Good copy, Kellen said. Oz, send the complete file. Everything you have. Names, addresses of the other victims. Bank records. Everything. Encrypt it and send it to my sat phone. Already on its way, Oz said. Jack, give him hell. That's the plan, Kellen said and ended the call. He stood up, the night air feeling electric on his skin. The grief, the apathy, the sense of displacement that had haunted him for years, it was all burned away. In its place was a singular, diamond-hard purpose. He was a hunter again. The prey was marked. The war he had tried to escape had found him, but it was a different kind of war. A cleaner war. This wasn't about politics or territory. This was about good and evil. It was a black and white world he understood perfectly. He walked back into the cabin. Havoc, who had been lying at his feet, rose and followed, his claws clicking softly on the wood floor. The dog knew. The scent of the hunt was on his master. Kellen went to a large, locked footlocker in the corner of the room. He didn't pull out rifles or explosives. He pulled out a simple black load-bearing vest, a set of lock-picking tools, a small coil of climbing rope, a roll of duct tape, and a pair of tactical gloves. He checked the magazine of his P226, not to add more rounds, but to ensure it was seated correctly. This wasn't an assassination. It was an interrogation. A reckoning. He looked toward the closed bedroom door. Sergeant Major Sterling was sleeping, hopefully dreaming of parades and past glories, not of eviction notices and despair. Kellen was his shield. He was the guardian for all the forgotten soldiers Thorne had victimized. Havoc, he said quietly. The dog looked up, his focus absolute. Stay? Watch him. The German shepherd walked to the bedroom door, lay down, and placed his head on his paws, his eyes facing the main entrance. He was on duty. A A silent, lethal protector standing guard over a sleeping hero. Kellen pulled on a black hoodie and walked out into the night. The engine of the F-250 roared to life, a promise of violence in the peaceful mountain darkness. He was no longer Jack Kellen, the haunted recluse. He was a Tier 1 asset, a weapon of vengeance, on his way to dismantle an empire of greed. He did not knock. He was about to kick the door in on Marcus Thorne's world, and he was going to bring the whole rotten structure down on top of him. The hunt was on. The Irvine Corporate Plaza was a monument to sterile, modern wealth. A 30-story tower of smoked glass and polished steel, it rose from the manicured landscape of Orange County like a shard of obsidian. At night, it was mostly dark, a hollow skeleton save for a few scattered lights where janitorial staff or obsessive executives still worked. On the 30th floor, a single wide window glowed, a beacon in the darkness. Thorne's office. Kellen didn't use the main entrance. He drove the F-250 into the multi-level parking garage, a cavern of concrete and fluorescent hum. He parked in a dark corner, far from the few other cars. He moved with a quiet, fluid purpose, a predator in his element. He wore simple black cargo pants, the hoodie, and running shoes. He carried nothing that would identify him. He was a phantom. He found the service corridor on the north side, just as Oz's schematics had indicated. The door was locked, but it was a simple commercial lock. His picks made short work of it. The door clicked open onto a narrow, concrete hallway that smelled of disinfectant and dampness. The service elevator was there, its steel doors closed. As Kellen approached, he heard a soft chime, and the doors slid open, an invitation from his ghost in the machine. He stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent, silent and smooth. There were no buttons to press. Oz was in control. Kellen stood in the center of the small car, his body relaxed but ready, his breathing slow and even. He was closing the distance to the target. The familiar, exhilarating calm of the final approach settled over him. This was his church. This was his sanctuary. The moments before contact. The elevator chimed again and stopped. The doors opened onto the 30th floor service area. It was dark, cluttered with cleaning carts and stacked boxes. Oz had done his job. Now it was Kellen's turn. He moved into the hallway, a ghost in the plush, carpeted corridor of power. The air was different here. It smelled of money, of expensive air freshener and leather. The walls were lined with abstract art that cost more than Sergeant Major Sterling's entire life savings. The contrast fueled the cold fire in his gut. Suite 3000. The name, Thorne Financial Group, was emblazoned on a frosted glass door in elegant silver lettering. To the right of the door was the biometric scanner Oz had mentioned, a small, glowing blue panel. A direct assault was an option, but it would be loud. Kellen preferred silence. He surveyed the architecture. Glass walls. A high-end drop ceiling. He looked up. The tiles were standard size. He reached up, pushed one, and slid it aside. Darkness. He pulled himself up with the silent, effortless strength of a man who had spent years scaling walls and obstacles. He was in the crawl space above the ceiling, a maze of ductwork, wiring, and steel beams. He moved with the quiet confidence of a rat in a wall, his senses guiding him through the dark. He navigated by the faint glow of the office lights filtering up through the ceiling tiles. He passed over the reception area, the bullpen of empty desks, and headed toward the large corner office that was still illuminated. Thorne's office. He positioned himself directly over the room and peered through a tiny gap between a tile and the metal grid. He saw him. Marcus Thorne sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his back to the door. He was sipping from a glass of what looked like expensive scotch, his other hand guiding a mouse as he stared at a complex spreadsheet on a wide, curved monitor. He looked relaxed, confident, the king in his castle. Kellen slid another tile aside, this one directly over a darkened corner of the office, behind a large potted plant. He lowered himself down, his feet touching the thick, plush carpet without a whisper of sound. He was inside. The infiltration was complete. He stood in the shadows for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting the rhythm of the room settle. The only sounds were the soft hum of the computer and the gentle clink of ice in Thorne's glass. Thorne sighed contentedly, leaning back in his high-backed leather chair. And, done, he murmured to himself, clicking the mouse. Another relic off the books. Kellen felt a jolt of pure hatred. He was talking about Sterling, or one of the others. To Thorne, they weren't men. They were entries in a ledger, problems to be solved and erased. It was time. Kellen stepped out from behind the plant. He didn't rush. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait across the vast expanse of the office. Thorne must have sensed the change in the room, the subtle shift in air pressure, the presence of another living being. The hairs on his arm must have stood up. He stiffened. He slowly turned his chair, a puzzled, annoyed expression on his face, expecting to see a janitor or a security guard. When his eyes landed on Kellen, the expression changed to one of startled confusion. He saw a large, imposing figure dressed in black, standing silently in the middle of his private sanctuary. "Who the hell are you?" Thorne demanded, his voice a mixture of arrogance and alarm. "How did you get in here?" "Security." Kellen didn't answer. He just stood there, a wall of silent judgment. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes like chips of granite. He let the silence stretch, let Thorne's feeble bravado evaporate in the face of the inexplicable. Thorne's eyes darted around the room, looking for a panic button for his phone. He was starting to realize that security wasn't coming. He was alone. "Look, if this is a robbery," Thorne began, his voice starting to tremble. "The petty cash is in the front desk. Take it." Kellen took another slow step forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his sat phone. He tapped the screen, bringing up a file. It was the list Oz had sent him, a list of names. "Sergeant William Davidson," Kellen said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "United States Army. Bronze Star. Died of a heart attack 2 weeks after you foreclosed on his home." Thorne's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "Petty Officer James Reed," Kellen continued, his voice relentless, each name a hammer blow. "United States Navy. Purple Heart. Took his own life after you drained his pension account." "This is insane," Thorne stammered, pushing his chair back. "You're insane." "And Sergeant Major Thomas Sterling," Kellen said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying more menace than a shout. "United States Marine Corps. Medal of Honor." At the mention of Sterling's name and the specific, impossible detail of his medal, Thorne's composure shattered completely. The last vestiges of his arrogance dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror. He knew, in that instant, that this was not a random robbery. This was a reckoning. "Who are you?" he whimpered, his voice a pathetic squeak. He was no longer a king in a castle. He was a cornered rat. Kellen took 2 more strides and was at the desk. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished mahogany, his sheer physical presence overwhelming Thorne. "I'm the guy who cleans up messes like you," he said, his voice a steel vice. "I'm the reinforcement he's been waiting for." Thorne scrambled backward in his chair, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at Kellen's face, at the cold, implacable fury in his eyes, and he saw not a man, but an instrument of justice. A force of nature that had come to his pristine, orderly world to tear it apart. The coward was exposed. The hunt was over. The judgment was about to begin. Thorne's carefully constructed world of power and control had crumbled into a landscape of pure terror. He stared at Kellen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. The man before him was not a disgruntled client or a corporate rival. He was something primal, something from a world of violence and consequence that Thorne had only read about in novels. "Please," Thorne finally managed to whisper, his voice thin and reedy. "Take whatever you want." "Money? I have money. I can transfer it. Any account you want." Kellen looked at him with an expression of utter contempt. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I want you to give it back." He walked around the desk, and Thorne flinched, trying to shrink into his chair. Kellen grabbed the back of the chair and spun it around to face the monitor. "You're going to make them whole," he commanded. "All of them." He pointed at the screen. "Log into your primary transfer account. Now." Thorne's hands were trembling so violently he could barely operate the mouse. He fumbled with the keyboard, his fingers slipping on the keys. I can't." Kellen's hand shot out and gripped the back of Thorne's neck. The grip wasn't brutal, but it was immovably firm, a promise of immense strength held in reserve. Thorne froze, a strangled yelp catching in his throat. "Breathe," Kellen said, his voice cold and clinical. Focus, and do exactly as I say. Under the terrifying pressure of Kellen's presence, Thorne managed to log into his bank's portal. A balance was displayed on the screen, a staggering number with multiple commas. It was the collected plunder of his reign of terror. "The file I sent you is on my phone," Kellen said, never taking his eyes off Thorne. "It contains the account information for every victim. You are going to initiate a wire transfer to each and every one of them." He read the first name from his phone, William Davidson's widow. "You stole $182,000, the equity from their home. You will return that amount, plus another $182,000 in punitive damages." Thorne stared at the screen, then at Kellen, his eyes pleading. That's over $360,000. For just 1 inch. He was a Bronze Star recipient, Kellen said, his voice dropping an octave. "You should be grateful I'm not charging interest. Do it." With shaking hands, Thorne began the transfer. He typed in the account number Kellen provided, entered the amount, and hesitated before the final confirmation. "Do you know what it feels like?" Kellen said quietly, his voice right next to Thorne's ear. "To watch your friends die for something you believe in? To carry them home under a flag? These men, they earned this. They bled for it. And you, a parasite in a suit, you stole it from them while they were at their weakest. You didn't just steal their money. You stole their honor. You stole their peace." He leaned closer. "Every dollar you transfer is a small piece of that honor being restored. Now, press the button." Thorne whimpered and clicked the confirmation. A significant chunk of his fortune vanished from the screen. "Next," Kellen said, his voice relentless. "Petty Officer Reed's daughter. You drained his pension. $97,000. Double it." For the next hour, the opulent office was filled with the quiet clicking of a mouse and the soft tapping of keys. It was the sound of an empire being dismantled, one transaction at a time. Kellen stood over Thorne, a silent executioner of finance, reading out names, account numbers, and amounts. With every transfer, Thorne seemed to shrink, the life draining out of him as his stolen wealth flowed back to its rightful owners. Finally, they came to the last name. "Sergeant Major Thomas Sterling," Kellen said. "You stole the last of his inheritance, $250,000. And for the disrespect you showed him, for calling a Medal of Honor recipient a relic, his punitive damages are not double. They are triple. $1 million? Thorne croaked, his face ashen. That's almost everything that's left." "It's not enough," Kellen said coldly. "Transfer it." Thorne made the final transfer. The vast sum that had once been his pride was reduced to a few $1,000s. He had been financially obliterated. But Kellen wasn't finished. "Now, the companies," he said. "Log into your corporate administration portal." Thorne, now a hollowed-out shell of a man, complied without protest. "You are going to file for the dissolution of every single one of your shell corporations. Apex Holdings, Summit Financial, all of them. 20 in total," Kellen commanded, reading from the data Oz had provided. "You will liquidate all remaining corporate assets and have them transferred to a single account. I have the number here." He provided the details for a new trust account that Oz had established on the fly, an entity designated for veterans' emergency restitution. One by one, Thorne's predatory empire was erased from existence with a series of legal clicks. The foundations of his wealth, built on the suffering of old soldiers, were turned to digital dust. When it was done, Kellen pulled a roll of heavy-duty duct tape from his pocket. "Stand up," he ordered. Thorne complied, his legs unsteady. Kellen spun him around and taped his hands securely behind his back. He then pushed him back into the chair. He walked over to Thorne's computer. "Your work isn't quite done," he said. He opened a blank document. "You're going to type a full confession." "A confession?" Thorne whispered. "Everything," Kellen said. "The scheme, the names of the victims, the amounts you stole. You will detail how you targeted them, how you defrauded them. You will admit to the financial pressure that led to the deaths of William Davidson and the others. You will sign it, and you will not leave a single detail out." Kellen dictated, using the comprehensive data from Oz, and Thorne typed, his taped hands making the process clumsy and slow. He detailed his own monstrous crimes, every word a nail in his own coffin. When the confession was complete, running several pages long, Kellen had him print 2 copies. He took one and folded it, placing it in his pocket. He laid the other on the desk. He then went to the main server closet in the office, pulled out all the hard drives, and placed them in a bag. The ledgers, the paper files, he gathered them all. The evidence. He returned to the desk and looked down at the broken, terrified man. Kellen had not laid a hand on him in anger. He had not broken any bones. He had simply held him accountable. He had destroyed his wealth, his empire, and his freedom. It was, as he had intended, a fate far worse than a quick death. "The FBI will be here in about an hour," Kellen said, his voice flat. "I'm making an anonymous tip. They will find the hard drives, the files, and your signed confession. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life in a place where men like you are not well regarded." He leaned down one last time, his face just inches from Thorne's. "When you're in your cell, I want you to remember their names. I want you to remember their medals. I want you to remember that they were giants, and you are nothing." He straightened up and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He left Thorne taped to his chair in the ruins of his life, a sniveling coward waiting for the inevitable arrival of justice. Kellen exited the office, walked down the silent, plush corridor, and called the service elevator. As the door slid open, he made 2 calls. The first was to the FBI's national tip line, a brief, anonymous message detailing the location of a major fraud operation and a confession. The second was to Oz. "It's done," Kellen said. "I've been watching the transfers," Oz replied, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "It's a thing of beauty, a symphony of financial destruction. The package is on its way to the authorities," Kellen said. "Threat neutralized." "Good work, brother," Oz said. "Welcome back." Kellen ended the call and stepped into the elevator. As he descended, he felt not elation, not joy, but a quiet, profound sense of rightness. The noise in his head, the ghosts of his own war, were silent. They had been replaced by the quiet hum of a mission accomplished. He had not only brought justice to a villain, but he had honored the promise he had made to his brothers in arms, to leave no man behind. Not on the battlefield, and not at home. The first hint of dawn was breaking over the mountains when Kellen's truck rumbled back up the winding road to the cabin. The eastern sky was a pale, bruised purple. He felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but it was a clean tired, the feeling of a hard day's work well done, not the soul-crushing fatigue of his grief. He parked the truck and entered the cabin as quietly as he could. A lamp was on, casting a soft, warm glow. Havoc lifted his head from his post at the bedroom door and gave a single, silent thump of his tail. He had not moved. From the bedroom, Sergeant Major Sterling emerged, fully dressed in his clean but worn clothes. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been waiting. He looked at Kellen, at the grim set of his jaw and the exhaustion in his eyes. He didn't ask what had happened. A senior NCO knows not to ask for a sitrep until the operator is ready to give it. "Morning, Sergeant Major," Kellen said, his voice raspy. "Coffee's on." "I made a pot," Sterling replied, gesturing to the kitchen. "Figured you might need it." Kellen poured himself a mug, the black liquid hot and strong. He sat down at the small table, and Sterling sat opposite him. For a moment, they just sat in the quiet companionship of the early morning, the silence broken only by the chirping of the first birds outside. "The threat has been neutralized," Kellen said finally, using the familiar language of the military. "The man, Thorne, he won't be bothering you, or anyone else, ever again." Sterling nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He looked at Kellen's hands, which were steady, and his eyes, which were clear. "Did you?" He hesitated, the question hanging in the air. "He is financially and legally ruined," Kellen clarified. "He's waiting for the authorities as we speak. I used his own systems against him. He paid his debts." Kellen pulled out his phone. "This is the part you need to see for yourself." He navigated to a banking app he had installed for this purpose and helped Sterling log into his own bank account. The old Marine squinted at the small screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then his eyes went wide. He stared, blinked, and stared again. He took the phone from Kellen's hand, holding it close to his face as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The balance, which for years had hovered near zero, now displayed a number so large it seemed impossible. It was the full amount of his stolen inheritance, plus the punitive damages Kellen had exacted. The phone trembled in Sterling's hand. His shoulders began to shake. A single, hard sob escaped him, a sound of such profound, gut-wrenching relief that it seemed to carry the weight of years of struggle and shame. He lowered his head, and tears he had held back for decades began to fall onto the table. He was not weeping for the money. He was weeping for the restoration of his life, for the lifting of a burden that had been crushing him. He was weeping because someone had fought for him. Kellen sat in silence, giving the old warrior the space for his hard-won catharsis. He reached across the table and placed a hand on Sterling's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. After a few minutes, Sterling composed himself, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked up at Kellen, his face a mixture of gratitude and awe. "How?" he whispered. "Why would you do all this?" "For me." Kellen looked at the shadow box, which Sterling had placed on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. "Because men like you are the reason I joined the Corps in the first place," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because we leave no one behind. You held the line for us, Sergeant Major. It was our turn to hold it for you." A new light entered Sterling's eyes. The despair was gone, replaced by a fire that Kellen had not seen before. It was the fire of a man with a purpose. "He did this to others," Sterling stated. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Kellen confirmed. "Dozens of them. They've all been made whole, financially. But the money is just the start." Sterling nodded, his mind already working, the old logistician and leader re-emerging from the fog of victimhood. They'll need help navigating this. Legal support. Someone to let them know they're not alone. The money Thorne had left over. The corporate assets you mentioned. What happens to that? "It's in a trust," Kellen said. "Administered by a man I trust completely." "We can use it," Sterling said, his voice gaining strength and authority with every word. "We can build something. A foundation. Not another outreach program. That's just a front for predators. A real one. Run by us. For us. We can call it the Sergeant Major's Watch. We'll be the sentries. We'll stand guard over our own." Kellen looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a victim to be rescued, but as a commander. The mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. Kellen had gone looking for a way to silence the ghosts of his past, but Sterling was showing him a new path, giving them a voice. "I think that's a brilliant idea, Sergeant Major," Kellen said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Kellen drove Sterling to a meeting with General Wallace on the base. The general, having been briefed on the situation, with the more extra-legal details tactfully omitted, threw the full weight of his office behind the new foundation. He provided legal advisors from the JAG Corps, office space on the base, and access to official channels to locate and contact the other victims. News of Thorne's arrest and the spectacular implosion of his fraudulent empire was a minor story in the national news. But for the community of veterans he had targeted, it was a seismic event. One by one, they were contacted by the new foundation. At first, they were skeptical, conditioned by years of being forgotten or exploited. But when they heard Sergeant Major Sterling's voice on the phone, when they saw the funds appearing in their accounts, disbelief turned to hope, and hope turned to action. Old soldiers, once isolated and ashamed, began to connect. They formed a new brotherhood, a network of support and vigilance. Kellen, working from the shadows, became their troubleshooter, their investigator, their shield. Oz, from his basement in San Diego, became their digital guardian, sniffing out other predators, creating firewalls to protect the vulnerable. The foundation, the Sergeant Major's Watch, became a beacon. It was a testament to the unbreakable bond of service, a promise that the generation that had fought in the mud and the snow would not be forgotten in the quiet twilight of their lives. A few months later, the scene is different. The air is warm, filled with the scent of salt and blooming hibiscus. We are on the porch of a small but beautifully maintained house, freshly painted a cheerful blue. It is Sergeant Major Sterling's house, not the one he had lost, but a new one, purchased with his restored funds, located in a quiet neighborhood with a view of the ocean. Sterling sits in a comfortable rocking chair, a glass of iced tea in his hand. He looks 10 years younger. The lines of worry on his face have been replaced by a serene contentment. He is on the phone, his voice calm and reassuring. "That's right, Gunny. The funds are yours. No strings attached. No, you don't owe us anything. Just promise me you'll keep an eye out for the others on your block. That's the spirit. Semper Fi." He hangs up and takes a slow sip of his tea, a satisfied smile on his face. Kellen is there, leaning against the porch railing, no longer a ghost in the shadows, but a solid, calming presence. The haunted look is gone from his eyes. The constant, grinding tension in his shoulders has eased. He is wearing a simple t-shirt with the logo of the foundation on it, an eagle, globe, and anchor standing sentinel on a watchtower. At his feet, Havoc lies sleeping in a patch of sun, his tail occasionally thumping against the wooden deck. His own nightmares seem to have subsided, replaced by the deep, peaceful slumber of a dog who knows his pack is safe. That was the last one, Sterling says, looking out at the ocean. The last man on Thorne's list. They're all safe now. All of them accounted for. It's a good day, Sergeant Major, Kellen says, his voice quiet. It's a new beginning, son, Sterling corrects him gently. For all of us. Kellen looks at the old Marine, his mentor, his friend. He looks at the peaceful ocean, at his loyal dog, at the Foundation's logo on his shirt. He had gone into the mountains seeking silence, an escape from the ghosts of his fallen brothers. But he had found his peace not in silence, but in service. He had found a new mission, a new squad. He had found a way to honor the dead by fighting for the living. The war inside him was finally over. He was home,